Welcome to Life After Loss with Louisa Smith and Pat Panetta.
Great to be here. We're back. Life After Loss for Griefline, and the Chief Marketing Officer from Griefline, Louisa Smith, is here. Hi, Lou.
Hi, Pat. Nice to be here.
Good to be back again. Now, it's all about having courageous conversations, taking the stigma away from grief. We're going to explore that again today, but really with the focus of losing a loved one, because we spoke about the different sorts of loss and grief, but that's our focus in today's session.
Yes, and often when people think about grief, the first thing they think about is bereavement and the loss of a loved one. So we have selected some really amazing people to interview today, people who have lost loved ones, but have also then used their experience to help guide other people through their loss as well. So
Yes.
I'm inspired by these people, and I hope the people listening and watching today are inspired as well.
Wonderful. And we'll meet our first guest soon. But that really sums up Griefline, you say, sort of referring to other people's stories and becoming a community and learning from each other. And that's what I love about our first guest, who spoke to many people who suffered loss. She's almost an expert in that space, I think, after writing this book. So, okay, let's do it. What do you think? Shall we meet our first guest?
Absolutely.
This is Life After Loss for Griefline Australia. Author and journalist Evonne Madden was motivated to write her book after the death of her husband Paul. And to tell us more, here's our special guest, author of Life After, Evonne Madden. Is it okay to call you an expert on grief and loss? Is that fair after writing this wonderful book?
I wouldn't call myself an expert, Pat, but I've spent a good couple of years interviewing people who've experienced grief. So
Wonderful. Okay, well, you're a journalist, mother, author, and earlier this year, Evonne published her first book, Life After, which we have here in the studio, which Evonne's left for me. Thank you, Evonne. Wonderful book. A testament to human resilience, Life After shares the raw, intimate and inspiring stories of more than 60 ordinary and well-known Australians while they come to terms with their grief. And Evonne will donate half of her royalties to the Peter MacCallum Centre in Melbourne. So, yes, tell us about this book.
So this book, I guess, has been a very long time in the making. I lost my husband, Paul, to cancer in 2015. We had two very young children at the time, Joseph and Heidi. It was probably only a couple of months after we lost Paul that I started thinking about writing this book. As a journalist, I guess the most obvious thing for me to do was to ask people how they were coping, how they had coped, how perhaps they weren't coping. Because to be honest, I was quite lost after losing Paul. And reading myself and speaking to other people was from the very beginning the thing that helped me the most, and perhaps the only thing. So I guess I started interviewing people a couple of months after Paul passed away and kept doing that for 4 or 5 years, actually. It took me a while to pull it together.
Well, there's a lot in the book. It's a wonderful book, lots of photos to help tell the stories. So, 4 or 5 years to put that together. Yeah,
it was a slow process in some ways, because I would go through times where I would be, interviewing and writing obsessively, and then, raising the kids took time, obviously. So it was a slow process.
I can see the time and effort that went into there, and I know that it would probably be very difficult for the people that you interviewed as well. So in their own time, to give them the space to actually deliver their message as well, because I know that when we discussed this earlier, you kind of let them lead their own narrative. It wasn't too influenced by you, was it?
No, well, the whole point, I guess, was to ask people to speak very honestly. I found personally that, it gets to a certain point and I think we're all expected to get over something like this. So I really wanted people to be as honest as they could be about what had happened. So they weren't, they certainly weren't formal interviews. They were really just conversations about, like you'd have with a friend. And so I just wanted them to. They led the conversations.
Yeah. So what did you learn about grief? Talking to 60 different people. What's the? I know it's a big, broad question, but. People suffer and have their own grief experience. It's unique to each person.
I think so. I think there's a lot of similarities as well. But I guess, to be honest, when I first started interviewing people, I think deep down I was hoping they might give me some answer. and it turns out there isn't one, but everyone finds their way eventually. But I think I just learnt it's hard for everyone, and a lot harder than I couldn't say I'd even imagined it, because when Paul was sick, I didn't contemplate the fact that that we could lose him. It was too hard to go down that track, so I didn't want to think about us losing him. So I think the main things I learnt from all of the people in the book are that everyone struggles with it and everyone finds a way eventually, but it takes a lot of time, and perhaps more time than I certainly would have imagined myself.
So Life After, the title, we were drawn to it because we'd developed our series based upon grief stories and the stories after the loss. So what brought you to that name?
I think it's partly a play on the term afterlife, but I really wanted to focus on not so much what happened to people, and there are some people in there that have faced really unimaginable trauma, but I didn't want to focus too much on what had occurred. There's an introduction to each person's piece that explains what has happened, but it's really about their grief and what came after.
Right. Yes, give us some examples of the people, because you're right, there's some sort of examples of trauma there which you'd think that people could never overcome. And I guess that's another point, that you never do overcome grief, you just move through it and you're a different person on the other end. Is that basically what happens, Evonne?
I think so. I mean, there are some pretty extreme examples in that book. I guess the most extreme example would be the Goldbergs, Abe and Sesha Goldberg. They survived the Holocaust, so that's clearly at the most extreme end of the spectrum, you'd have to say. And I was inspired by every single person in this book, but I spent a lot of time with Mr. and Mrs. Goldberg, and every time I'd leave their home, I'd just think it was really a privilege to meet them, but you've never met two happier people, so positive. So their story is they met shortly after they survived the Holocaust, and they married a few months after they got out of the concentration camp, moved to Australia. They've set up life in Melbourne, have had a family. They've achieved so many great things, and I guess, I might have been having a bad day, but I'd often think about those two and think, well, if they can, silly. There's obviously no comparison, but they're just two really inspiring people.
Is there a mindset, Louisa, that you experience at Griefline that, I hear this story about these survivors. Is it about a mental attitude? They're sort of somehow positive. Does that sort of pull you through when you're sort of stuck in grief?
I don't know about that. I think it's more about allowing people to have the space to tell their story and to just work through it in their own way and in their own time. I think reaching out to have the conversation is probably the most courageous thing, and that's really the biggest step you can ever make in your journey through your loss and your grief experience. And that's why I was so drawn to Evonne's book, because what we see on the helpline is how inspired people are to move forward once they just start talking about it. It's when you bottle it up and you don't share and you keep it to yourself that could potentially manifest into something a lot more serious, and that's how potentially you can get stuck in your grief. Yes. So when you read this book and you hear all the different stories, and there's, not all the stories have the fairy tale ending. It is very, very difficult for very many people, but they're all brave enough to speak to Evonne about their story, and that may or may not have been cathartic for them. But what I've drawn from the pages is that many of them hadn't spoken to anyone before they spoke to Evonne about their loss. So I wonder how they are today. Have you heard from anyone since you published the book? Yeah, I have. I've been in touch with a lot of them, and I guess I developed a quite close relationship with a number of people in the book because we spent a lot of time together, often before they agreed to be part of the book. And then there was a lot of time after we do the interview, after I'd go away, transcribe the interview, write a piece in their own words. That's probably an important part about this book. It's all in their own words, even though I've helped, craft it. But it's all in their own words. And I think that when I'd hear back from people, I think a lot of people like the opportunity
to speak about their grief, but also the person that they lost, because there's also a bit of pressure sometimes to leave that person behind a little bit.
Yeah. Why do we do that why don't we talk about grief more? Because it's it's what's coming, the realisation for me doing this series. I mean, it's as simple as talking about it and not pretending it doesn't exist. So why do we, and you spoke to people from different cultural backgrounds in your book as well, so do different societies and cultures handle grief differently? Should we talk about it more?
I think so. That is a theme that's popped up in this book, and like I said, I certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert on this topic, but that's one reason why I interviewed a grief and trauma specialist in this book, Mikhail de Willoughby. She has had some very big losses in her life personally, but she has interviewed hundreds or thousands of people, not interviewed, but just had therapy with a huge number of people. And her comment was that we don't do grief well in Australia. She finds that there is pressure to move on, and whether that's, I think it's an external pressure, but also an internal one. I remember myself thinking quite early on, get moving, and you perhaps should be feeling better by now, but I wasn't. I was really struggling for years. And I think there's also perhaps an expectation from people who perhaps haven't had a loss yet, and we all have them eventually. So I think there's a pressure to perhaps say you're going a bit better than you perhaps are.
Is that your personal experience, losing Paul?
Well, yeah, it is. Like I'm lucky. I had great support, wonderful family, a lot of great friends, including Paul's friends. They were perhaps among the most supportive group of people, Paul's friends. But I still felt that after a time, you think, oh, you're not still upset, are you? And again, that's not my family and friends, but you feel that, and it might have been in my head. But I felt that, after a certain number of years, perhaps I shouldn't be talking about Paul as often as I was and still do. But it's...
Yeah, of course. Yeah. From Griefline's point of view, the fact that we don't talk about grief, is that one of your biggest challenges, Louisa, in your role and with Griefline, is to change the mindset of our community?
Yeah. And again, why I engaged Evonne for this interview and our other guests later on is because they're really getting behind the conversation and encouraging people to talk about their losses. And, forever I'll be devoted to opening up safe spaces for people to talk about it, whether it's in this environment or in, looking at new programs and services where we can invite people from different cultures and backgrounds to come in and have that conversation, whether it's online forums, over the phone. It is all about ensuring that people do feel safe. And sometimes that's just being anonymous. So having someone that you can speak to that's not related to you, not in your community, not in your network, someone that you feel comfortable won't judge you and won't judge your personal experience. It's just someone that will listen to you. And that's what makes the helpline so unique and so important as well, because anyone can call it. And, our volunteer supporters are trained to just create that safe environment for them without judgment.
And in a way, Evonne, you created that similar sort of vibe. But when I hear that, you're a journalist, you've come to these people and, there was no sort of family connection, or you're just a person that had no opinion on what was going on, so they were able to talk to you. So you're helping these people in your book and also helping yourself. Is that sort of why you wrote the book?
I think so. I hope it did help. I think, as I said before, I think a lot of people perhaps were just relieved to talk about it, and I think it does help that I was a stranger to almost all of these people. So it's sometimes easier to relate to people that don't know you and the intimate details of your life. But just with what you said before, Louisa, one of the very first things I did after Paul passed away was I joined a group, and it was for other people who had lost their partner at a young age, and I couldn't wait to get there every month or however often we met, but it was just a really comforting place to be.
Yes.
And that peer environment, just connecting with people that understand what you're going through, I think is really powerful. We've just launched support groups at Griefline, and the feedback has been overwhelmingly similar to Evonne's, where it's just, okay, I know that this person knows exactly what I'm going through because they've experienced the loss of a loved one as well.
Yes, that's the beauty of reading this book too. You connect with the people in the book and hear their story, and it helps you. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And something else is the sharing of coping strategies, and people have different ways to cope. And I could imagine after interviewing 60 people, there would be some really great tips and ideas around, how people can cope with the loss of a loved one. Did you want to share?
It's not a self-help book as such. It is a massive collection of a lot of ideas about how people get through. But to think of very specific coping strategies, I think I've found, and I think most people in this book have eventually found a way, but I think it almost always comes back to time and having support, opening up. You mentioned before perhaps the problems that can come if you don't have an opportunity to speak about how you've been going. But Damien Oliver, the Melbourne Cup winning jockey, is in this book, and he spoke about that as well. So he said that he described himself as an introvert and said he didn't really talk so much about the loss of his brother Jason, and also his father Ray. So they both died in racing accidents, and he commented that that's something that he would have done differently. Perhaps just tried to talk a bit more, open up a bit more.
And there's an iconic photo when he won the Melbourne Cup, on Media Puzzle, looking to the sky.
Yeah.
In 2002. So I guess is that sort of, from his, the sporting background, I get the feeling that you got to be tough and not talk about loss and just sort of get on with it type thing.
Yeah. I was really drawn to his story as well because I wanted in this book to look at people who had experienced grief in a very public way. And at the time he was under a lot of pressure to make a decision about whether or not to ride in that race. So that was only, a week or so after Damien lost his brother Jason, and he said he spoke to his mother and they had the conversation about, should I ride? And the consensus was, of course, I've got to ride. That's exactly what my brother would want to do. But I couldn't really imagine the pressure that I guess as a jockey you would be anyway on that day, but just the glare and that spotlight on him that day. But he said he felt some comfort, that kind of safe place for him is being on the horse. The rails are between him and everyone watching. So he said it was almost a relief to be riding that day. It kind of gave him a bit of respite from what had happened and what he was going through and the attention that was coming his way as a result.
And that reminds me as well about Archie Roach's story and how he lost his wife and then the very next day he had to perform. Well, he didn't have to, but he chose to perform, and how lifted up he was by the response of the crowd when he did go ahead with the performance. And I just I think that everyone, again, has their own way of coping, and for these people who are athletes or performers, that maybe through their work, that's when they find the catharticism.
Yes.
I think also there's even a level just of simple distraction, I think, as well sometimes. Going back to what people know how to do so well, it just gives them some temporary relief from how they're feeling. But it's incredible to think that Archie was able to do that so soon after losing Ruby.
And are you motivated by losing the person? Do you feel the presence of that? Talk again about the photo when he looked up, his brother was there. Do you feel when writing this book, Paul sort of had a hand in writing the book, your husband? So is there a bit of that too, that you feel the energy of the one you've lost and you do it for them as well?
I feel that more, I guess, when I'm raising our kids, Joseph and Heidi. I feel like he's there with me in some kind of way. I often think if I'm, trying to work out what to do with some, parenting thing, and I often think, what would Paul do? What would Paul say? So I feel like he's helping and there with me in that way. Not really in anything beyond that, but I just like to think about what he'd do.
That's really lovely.
Now, talking about the public losses like Damien Oliver, but also in your book, tragedies, the Hoddle Street massacre and Bali bombings. You spoke to people who lost people in, terrorist attacks and those awful situations. So what do you get from those conversations? Is it different than losing somebody in another way?
I think so. I think if the example of the Hoddle Street massacre in the book, Adam Skinner lost his mother, Tracy, in that awful massacre, and he was a toddler sitting on his mum's lap when she was shot.
Right,
And
she was sitting in her car at the time?
Yep,
Right,
sitting in her car next to her husband, who was Adam's dad, and he was a toddler. And Adam was really great to speak to because he was so very open about the challenges he's faced throughout his life. So he's someone that he's had to grow up hearing the name Julian Knight on the news
But he refused to use the name.
he doesn't.
When he spoke to you.
He doesn't use that man's name,
Yep.
but he's still had to, the anniversaries, and I think he's a really good example of someone who, we all see these tragedies on the news, and the next day we're onto something else.
Yeah.
But this, and if they're a big event like this, they're revisited for anniversaries, but this is something that's with these people every single day. We all move on, the news cycle moves on, but these big events are really life-changing.
On the other end of the spectrum, there's people like Walter McCack. How did you feel talking to someone like Walter and what he'd been through?
So Walter, as we know, lost his wife and two daughters in the Port Arthur massacre. Not long after that, he actually wrote to Prime Minister John Howard at the time asking for law reform, really, around guns. And he was successful in doing that, and the laws around guns were changed not long after. But he's also set up the Alana and Madeline Foundation, which it's quite broad what that organisation does, but it really aims to protect children from violence. So that includes, things as extreme as what his family experienced, but it's also things like cyber safety. There's various programs in schools across the country and perhaps even overseas. So he's just worked very hard on a number of fronts to protect children from what his own children had to go through. He's the last person in the book, so I wanted to finish with his words, because to find a way what he went through, or way through what he went through, and to achieve what he's achieved, and to be as positive as he is, I thought that was a really nice way to finish the book, because it's, I don't think any of us can imagine what he's gone through, but all these years later, he's doing well and was happy to speak in this book he wanted to help other people who are struggling with grief themselves.
So were you struck by that? Some people who use the pain and they've grown through it, and they've, as you say, created another life, or I guess you're different after the experience, versus those who weren't able to get through it. Is that something that struck you when talking to so many people?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess I wouldn't really compare any of the people in the book, because I think everyone was really honest and very open, but I haven't really drawn any conclusions about who's done it better, or everyone's got very different situations. But it was just really interesting to hear from all of them. And
What we know with Griefline and the work that we do is that what happens in your life up to that point of your loss also influences the way that you grieve as well. So and that's why everyone's experience is so different, because everyone's lifestyle, culture, religion is different. So and their family situation as well, their socio-economic situation, demographics come into play here. So how their life was up until that point can influence the way that they grieve once they've experienced a loss as well. And there can be lots of other losses that occurred in their life before that time that can really compound their grief experience. So we have to be really mindful of that when we're speaking to these individuals that reach out to us.
Yes, considering the full picture. So it's a bit of a lottery in a way, when I hear you say that. I mean, your upbringing, it's something you can't control. So you just sort of you've wired a certain way or programmed a certain way, and grief affects us all, so we need to sort of deal with it. So I guess from Griefline's point of view, sometimes you have to untangle that background or that history to ensure people can get through it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, now the book, of course, Evonne, how can we find the book? I can see here that you can get it online at Booktopia, but we can find it at all great bookstores?
Yeah, it's in bookstores. But I guess if I just very quickly could, I just wanted to acknowledge the photographers that I've worked with for this book, because it's the portraits are a very important part of this book. It wouldn't have become a book without them, actually. And so that's Lisa Leake, Penny Stevens and Martin Philby, and also the designer, Anita.
Great
Hutchins.
photos. I think that's, and Lou's got a copy of the book, of course. Yeah, it sort of helps tell the story. Yeah, so a wonderful photographer. The name again?
Three of them, actually. So Lisa Leake, Penny Stevens and Martin Philby, and also the designer, Anita Lazell.
There you are.
Thank you.
Life After, Evonne Madden. And no matter how tough or horrible your grief experience is, Lou, you can get through it and connect with life after loss.
Yeah. It's just like everything else in life. It is a choice, and it is up to you. And the best step you can ever take is to reach out and speak to someone.
Life After Loss for Grief Line with Evonne Madden, and Life After is the book. And thank you so much for your time.
We all experience grief and loss. We don't need to go through it alone. Griefline offers free counselling and support, holding space for you to be heard without judgment or labels. We listen, connect, and empower. Our telephone counsellors are available 365 days a year, so there's always someone to talk to. Our supportive online community helps you share and connect to people with similar experiences. And our website gives you access to digital resources, wellbeing practices, and coping strategies. It's never too early or late to seek support. We're here to help you heal and find a way forward together.
You don't have to face your grief alone. Call Griefline 1300 845 745 or visit griefline.org.au.